I'm at that time of year where all I can imagine is how nice it must be to be in New York. For some reason in my life, I haven't gone to New York that much. I don't want to give the impression that I'm a jet setter. But I have gone to New York a lot in the fall, and I love the States in the fall with the leaves and the cold, and a new Broadway season, which this year is being dominated by Brits once more.
Yeah. Once more, I feel like every year, not to like sing Rule Britannia every morning, but it does feel like every year we always have some very heavy hitters that have started out in the UK and then go over to America and cook up a storm. I wonder if it's partly down to the fact that international producers know that it's cheaper to make shows in the UK.
Oh, yes.
So they might start them here in order to take them over there. But it's great for us because then we feel like we had first dibs on something that's going to be an international success.
I think that's probably true. And it does give you an opportunity to have a rethink on things, which has happened with Jez Butterworth's The Hills of California.
True, which interestingly seems to have rewritten its ending.
Yes, on mid-air.
Yeah, it was very funny talking to some of our American peers where we were almost cross-referencing notes about, oh, did this happen? And then did this happen? And they said, no, why would that happen? And we're like having to adjust our expectations about what the play is or could be. And Jez Butterworth did a really interesting interview with David Gordon at Theatre Mania, and he said that he was sat in previews for the West End version of The Hills of California at the Howell Pinter Theatre earlier this year. And he said within 2 previews, he knew exactly what he needed to change and what needed fixing, so that by the time it got to Broadway, he was ready and waiting. So the West End was essentially a dummy run. A
pre-Broadway tryout. taking the role of some upstate theatre.
But but normally, of course, he's had a long track record of starting shows at the Royal Court and then transferring them into the West End. So by missing that Royal Court opportunity, the West End was essentially the same thing where he got to means test the material. But it is getting all-out raves on Broadway.
It's extraordinary, isn't it? Because obviously that changed, because it was so nearly a brilliant play. And it had a last act that didn't work. I mean, I think everybody agreed when it opened in London that the first 2 acts were superb, but then the last act just didn't resolve an awful lot of the problems that he'd set up to be resolved. Yeah, so that's a reason. And the last act now has been changed substantially, which feels like a reason to hop on a plane. I'm going to New York. It'd be so nice. But in the meantime, I'm going to get through this episode of the What's on Stage podcast with me, Sarah Crompton.
And me, Alex Wood.
And actually, the other reason to hop on a plane is that Sunset Boulevard has opened with Nicole Scherzinger to, again, pretty rave reviews.
Yes, barring a few naysayers, including a slightly sniffy New York Times review, but the vast majority of critics fall in line with where the West End stood on the show, of it being a revelatory new take on a classic, and we've discussed it at length on this podcast before, so please check out old episodes. But seeing Broadway almost echo what the West End has been saying about it is a very nice thing to do. But also, again, there were a few changes there, almost out of necessity. So one thing that's been spotted is that, at the start of Act 2, Tom Francis does a very famous walk around the venue and goes out of the venue onto the streets. In London, it was on the Strand. In New York, it's across the streets of New York. But obviously, the streets of New York are slightly more busy and full of tourists than the Strand might have been. Although the Strand's relatively busy, I think New York is a whole other level. So as he walks, I think an ensemble essentially joins him to create a bit more of a... to protect him.
Protect him random questions from passers-by.
Yeah, exactly.
Just brilliant.
And I think there's also a man in a monkey suit that's been introduced.
Ooh.
So, yes, even more reason to hop on a plane to see a guy dressed as a monkey.
I think there are lots of interesting things actually to talk about with Sunset Boulevard, and we have talked about the show considerable amount. One thing is that I think the Theatre Mania review said that Or in fact, no, it wasn't Theatre Mania. It was you introducing the Theatre Mania in your excellent reviews roundup on What's on Stage, the website, where you say that when it opened in London, there was a degree of cynicism about whether Scherzinger could carry it and, what Jamie was going to do to it. And that hasn't happened at all in America. They've just accepted the notion that she is a good enough singer and actress to carry that role. And whether that's because of the preparation of the London reviews, I don't quite know. But it is a completely different context into which it's landed. And she's committed to do the role for a year, which is, till July, hasn't she? Which is a really long and committed run. I'm impressed by that. But the other interesting thing from the point of view of this podcast, which likes to talk about writing as well as theatre, is that the New York Times review by Jessie Green is a very interesting example of two things. One, it's a review that doesn't like the show. Essentially, it reviews not the production, but the whole notion of Andrew Lloyd Webber rethinking Billy Wilder's movie and turning it into a musical. And Jessie is obviously entirely out of sympathy with that and feels that it lost the cynicism of the movie, made it into a romantic extravaganza. So the review is mainly about that. And it's very interesting. It's really well-written, well-conducted argument, but it's absolutely not engaging with the production. And the other thing that's interesting to me is how powerful the New York Times still is. Because in the old days, that kind of slightly tepid review would have damaged a show's chance of landing. I'm not absolutely sure that one dissenting voice is going to carry enough weight to stop Sunset Boulevard marching to triumph and marching to triumph at the Tonys and so on.
It's really fascinating because you've had Matt Wolfe, who is also a wonderful theatre critic on both sides of the Atlantic, gave it a glowing review in London. So to some extent, that New York Times review coming out now from Jessie Green is part two of what a consensus has already been formed, but now it's almost a reinterpretation of that consensus. So it probably isn't as damaging as if the New York Times hadn't reviewed it in London and then came in with this slightly more cynical take once it hit Broadway. To your point about Nicole Scherzinger, the one thing that was interesting for me is that she'd obviously been in London before. She'd been on stage at the Palladium in Cats.
Yeah.
So she'd done Lloyd Webber, she'd done the West End, but she'd never done Broadway in any capacity.
No,
so
she wasn't been there. Yeah.
So even though she was already picking up dozens of awards in London for her amazing performance in Sunset Boulevard, at that point she had never stepped onto a Broadway stage in a full production before. So I think that's probably why she's getting so many rave reviews now, because she hasn't had any experience in the same context on Broadway. And
she really didn't expect to go to Broadway. I did a big interview with her for American Vogue and really liked her actually and enjoyed her company, and she just kind of tell it how it is. She doesn't hide much away. And she said that, when she was growing up, she dreamed of being a musical theatre star. That's really what she starts out to be. And she got slightly diverted into pop and into pop success. And so to eventually get to Broadway at this point in her career really feels like, for her, a dream come true. And she had a very nice line about, that she always feels the fraud in any room because she's surrounded by people who've done theatre all their lives and she feels that she's an imposter. But actually, she's really a music theatre girl at heart. I mean, that is the essence of I think, her singing in many ways. I think she is, she's a good interpreter of a song, which Lloyd Webber recognised and which Jamie Lloyd recognised. And that's why I think she's come through so strongly and landed so powerfully in this part. So that's, I think, fun. And it'd be interesting with the Tonys and see how it does do, because it's obviously made its case as a contender.
One thing that a lot of these productions that are hopping over from the UK to Broadway are doing that I really admire is the fact they aren't just taking the production, but they're also taking a lot of the stars with them. So Hills of California has essentially taken all of the female lead performers with them, which is amazing.
Yeah.
Operation Mincemeat hasn't announced casting yet, but hopefully that will take some of its originating cast members. But even in Sunset Boulevard, it wasn't just Nicole that went over, it was also the wonderful Tom Francis, who was never put a foot wrong or a note wrong when he was doing his Sunset Boulevard. But also Grace Hodgett Young, the WhatsOnStage Award winner, who was amazing as Betty and left a real impression. And then you get David Thaxton, West End legend, making his Broadway debut as Max. So again, they're thinking, the vital to the success of this show isn't simply Nicole or Jamie Lloyd, it is everyone. And they've also taken over some of the camera operators and some of the ensemble as well. So it's really quite lovely to see that happen, because a lot of producers would just take the material over and leave the cast behind.
Yeah. No, I think that is brilliant. And that's something that's definitely changed, because there was that terrible tense moment where West End successes used to be entirely recast for Broadway and maybe have one surviving original cast member. So I really like that it happens. Mincemeat's fascinating, isn't it? About how that is going to transfer, and whether that kind of very British ambience will win over American audiences.
It's clearly something that the show itself has also been slightly aware of, because they sent out a poll to both their UK fans and American members of their mailing list, asking, do you think this will work on Broadway? You know, with the rapid fire British humour and sensibility, is it just something that will gloss over a lot of Americans' heads? I anecdotally have heard rave reviews from a lot of Americans that have seen it, so I don't think it's as much of a concern as it might be. And also, if you take shows like Beyond the Fringe, that actually opened at the very same venue many, many years ago, which is the bedrock of contemporary British humour.
Yeah.
Starting point
for everything.
A huge Broadway sensation, considering it was just 4 uni students at the time that were just sort of honing their craft. I feel as though Broadway audiences are totally fine with a bit of British whimsy. Even shows like The Play That Goes Wrong became record breakers in their own time. Indeed,
and Six, I think is a very sort of British sensibility. I think that's actually what I mean when I started off by saying, you know, the Brits taking over Broadway, because there was a period in the 80s, especially in the musicals, you know, when the American musical was struggling to get a grip, and Lloyd Webber's juggernauts essentially were just completely taking over the Broadway theatres. Actually, the balance is probably much better now, where there's a greater mix of American grown shows on Broadway alongside the British ones. But even in the musicals, you've got things like the Alicia Keys' Hell's Kitchen, which apparently is the most fabulous show. Another reason to get on a plane. But I hope it will come here. And so there's kind of, you know, you look at the theatre fronts, which I sometimes tragically do and try and pretend I'm there. You know, you've got British origin shows, American shows. There's a sense of a better theatre ecology, I feel, and different flavours of shows having different kinds of success.
The success of The Hills of California, for me, almost echoes what happened with the Lehman trilogy, where, yes, it got some very lovely reviews in the West End, but never found any sort of award success until it went to Broadway. And there they absolutely, you know, adored it, and it won 5 Tony Awards. And I think if I was going to put money anywhere at this very early stage of the Broadway season, I'd expect something similar for The Hills of California.
Interesting.
Because it's already gained such a strong momentum, but hopefully that can then continue through. But Sonia Freeman, the producer, has done something similar with shows like Leopoldstadt, that she will keep open for a relatively lengthy amount of time for a play, just to keep that awards momentum and conversation going. She knows how to bring shows over
she's
to
really
Broadway.
Clever. And also, I suppose there's the possibility that Hills of California will come back and have another West End run, garlanded in Broadway glory, as has happened with the Lehman trilogy, which had the Broadway run, went to Australia, has been a worldwide success. I mean, it's an astonishing phenomenon, really. It's a 3-hour play with 3 people in it that has gathered this reputation and is now back in the West End, and is fabulous, and, you know, survives repeated recasting and offers a deep insight, I think, into the modern world. And it's interesting, just as I say that, I think as well, there's something about these shows that they are about theatrical craft somehow. I think that's one quality that the Brits bring, is that, you know, Jamie Lloyd, it's a technological wonder, that show. The video and the projections are magisterial. They're really, really brilliant. And I think, you know, Lehman trilogy is such a well-conceived piece of theatre, as indeed is Operation Mincemeat, this very small company, very big theme. So I wonder if there's something about that sensibility that makes British theatre ecology different.
I'm going to nail a really excellent segue here, but in terms of talking about technological craft, Sonia Freeman, British shows transferring and bringing over UK stars, Stranger Things The First Shadow is also in this season, which will star Louis McCartney, who made his professional debut as Henry Creel in the West End production and won a Critics' Circle Award for his performance. So he's going over with the show to the Marquee Theatre in March 25. So Sonia Freeman's basically going to have two plays up against each other on Broadway at the same time, both vying for the Tony Awards. But again, it's fantastic that they've decided just to bring over a talent who is at the start of what is sure to be a pretty stellar career in order to land probably one of the most high-budget productions that Broadway will see this year, judging by the technological feats that are pulled off in Stranger Things The First Shadow and the size of that company, because it is huge. But if you look back on a show like Harry Potter and the Cursed Child, a lot of the younger performers that are in that have now gone on to huge TV and film careers.
Yeah.
And they started in the West End and then on Broadway, and then have gone on from there. So hopefully Louis McCartney will have something similar.
So an excellent calling card. And you were talking earlier about Kit Connor, who is opening slightly differently, but in Romeo and Juliet.
Yes, with Rachel Zegler as Juliet, the West Side Story and Hunger Games star, with Jack Antonoff, the famous music producer and composer, making the music for it. So it's a musicalized Romeo and Juliet that has become very TikTok friendly. So there are clips of the balcony scene, and one of the moments that has been spread online and probably dubiously filmed from the audience is he does half the balcony scene while suspended from a sort of a raised dais, and he's just holding on by his arms and doing the lines up.
Wow.
And then obviously there's the moments where Juliet is mumbling and deciding whether or not to send him away or keep him going, and that's now a comedic moment because she's basically toying with him, being like, oh no, come back, oh stay, and he's suspended in the air from his arms for a good 20-30 seconds. I mean, showing off his considerable physical prowess at that point. But it seems like it's a show that's very much made with those sort of Gen Z audiences in mind, which is quite refreshing for Broadway to think about that audience, that they might not have the same disposable income as some audience members that are going to plays like Hills of California, but they're just as important for the theatre ecology. So you need to make plays with them in mind. So it's very wonderful seeing that get such a sort of huge following online.
And talking about younger audiences, in my rather brilliant segue, you can tell me about your weekend at Musical Con.
Yes, I mean, it was quite a chaotic weekend, and the theatre scheduling gods were playing with us all, because over the weekend it was Musical Con at the Excel Centre in London, and then on Sunday it was the UK Theatre Awards, and then that same day it was also the 25th anniversary of The Lion King. So they had a big celebration outside the Lyceum Theatre in the West End. And I tried to do all of those things on the same
Ambitious.
day.
You did send me to see Tangent, the Forsyte Saga, as a result. So I spent the day in the theatre as well, seeing rather good production at the Park Theatre of Forsyte Saga. Yes. Carry on.
So Musical Con is this fantastic event that is now in its third year. So I think the fourth year would be next year, where a variety of shows from across the UK converge on the Excel Centre alongside tens of thousands of theatre fans who want to hear panels from their favourite shows, hear performances from their favourite performers, or go around all these stalls from bespoke retailers or people who are making merchandise or trinkets or memorabilia, or charities that are wanting to display, all their latest offerings. And there's also huge stalls. So Cameron McIntosh had a very interactive stall that occupied many square meters, where you could make your own masks for Phantom of the Opera or interact with some of the props. I even think that they got the robotic pig from Betty Blue Eyes tucked away in a corner for people to find for the diehard fans of Cameron McIntosh musicals. So it's really just a love letter to the fans is how they style it.
Wow.
And it's a great opportunity for new shows to have their moment in the spotlight. And talking about Gen Zs, one of the things that I noticed, that one of the most well-attended main stage sessions was for Why Am I So Single? And I think a lot of those were for new fans who had come up with shows like Six, then actually now being able to see what those writers are doing next. And one of the things that struck me is that obviously I've been working at WhatsOnStage now for coming up on 8 years. For some people, Six is still a new musical, a disruptor, yes, a new entity, I think for us included. But for many of the fans that are at MusicalCon, Six has been around for as long as they've known about theatre. It has always been there, in the same way that something like Mamma Mia or The Lion King for us has been there for a quarter of the century. You know, they might have been 10 or 11 years old when Six first premiered. So now when they're 17 or 18, it's a part of the fabric of musical theatre. It is no longer a disruptor. It is the quintessential show. So that was very interesting, just to see that new perspective and that new generation of musical fans and what their tastes are like and what they respond to.
And it is interesting as well, because with Why Am I So Single, I've had quite a lot of conversations about how it sustains itself in the West End, because it's a show that is absolutely for Generation Z, and it's so much about young people's feelings, romantic lives, and so on. But it's also sharply clever. I mean, I'm definitely not Gen Z, and I adored it. And you can see, but it's harder to attract people like me. It's harder to have a show about dating that is going to appeal to, you know, your average musical goer who's perhaps in their 40s and with a family and looking for a family show. It's not a family show. So it is facing, and all these kind of experimental younger musicals are facing the challenge of how to not to get an audience, because there's always an initial audience, but it's how to sustain the audience and how to justify it. So I think it's really interesting that they're doing things like MusicalCon and generally sort of pushing for a different view. And it's interesting you talk about The Lion King, because I was at the first night of The Lion King, which is 25 years ago. Wow. And it was very much recalled for me this week, because I went to a memorial service for the legendary theatrical PR, Lynn Kerwin, who ran a company called Lynn Kerwin Associates. And she was the press officer and publicist for The Lion King when it came to London. And what I had forgotten, because obviously it's been there for 25 years, was how radical a show it was, and how much that was definitely reaching out to a different audience. You know, Disney at that point did not put on stage shows. Julie Taymor, nobody had heard of her. The idea that you were going to make a musical, even though it had Elton John, which was a big help, but the idea that you were going to make a musical out of an animation and you were going to stage it using African traditional dance was totally radical. And we were all older people sitting around and remembering Lynn and remembering her warmth and her clarity and her persuasive powers and her great advocacy for young people and for young women, actually, particularly. She was a wonderful mentor to many people. But she was also a brilliant advocate for different types of theatre. And all of us remembered her ringing us up and telling us about this show and really being profoundly sceptical. A couple of lucky people got to the States to see it, Matt Wolfe included. I didn't get to the States to see it, but I did commission. I was working for the Telegraph magazine at that time and commissioned an interview with Julie Taymor, which now looks relatively smart. And then that first night, and you know, the dancers come down the aisle and they're singing, and oh my God, you know, it was so emotional. It was unbelievable.
I hadn't seen it before this week,
which makes me feel very, very old.
I've hit a new landmark, because I've realised that with The Lion King, I've now seen this show in every single West End theatre, which I had not done until that point. So
impressive.
I can pat myself on the back for that one. The one thing that was most striking for me is that obviously it's a hour-and-a-half long film having to be turned into a 2 hour and 10 minutes worth of show, not including the interval. How do you add the extra 40 minutes without losing the narrative momentum that The Lion King has to keep young audiences invested? And actually the moments of really quite beautiful, quiet sometimes quite empty stagecraft where it is performers that are dressed as termite hills.
Yes.
On point, so doing ballet whilst dressed as a termite hill, but actually being able to use that simply a single performer on a very large empty stage, or a small group of performers that are playing like a pack of a pride of lions. I think pride of lions. Pride of lions. There we go.
Pride. No, it's definitely a pride of lions. I know that
yes,
collective.
Simba's pride. Allowing that sheer magic of simply existing on a stage and saying kids will still find this really beautiful and engaging, even if you're not watching a herd of wildebeest chasing down Simba or something. They can be just as moved by something quiet and contemplative and slow. Is really actually quite an audacious thing to decide to do, because you could quite easily have just said, okay, let's get in all the big hits, quick, get it done in under 2 hours, and we'll get everyone out and they'll be happy and they'll have seen the songs they love and they'll have sung along to the Circle of Life. But actually, I think they've achieved something far more impressive and long-lasting by thinking more about, what is the kind of stage language that we can bring in here that we couldn't bring into the film.
And so did it still absolutely land for you? Because I have seen it. I've seen it about 4 times, but I haven't seen it in the last 10 years.
There were definitely bits that showed their age. One thing I would say is that in the last quarter century, puppetry has come on so far. Looking at shows like Warhorse, Life of Pi, My Neighbor Totoro, each setting a new benchmark for what puppetry can achieve on a stage, that when you look back at The Lion King, it's almost like quite nostalgic now, seeing these puppets. Some of them are very impressive, and I think they keep updating them. They are still excellently presented, and I think that actually, even if they are more static, the beauty of seeing them on stage does enough anyway. So yeah, I think that was something that slightly felt a bit older, but you can't beat like the Circle of Life at the beginning of The Lion King. I think still remains one of the most iconic opening sequences, if not the iconic opening sequence of any West End show. Yeah,
it is just amazing and heartstopping. And in fact, they sang Circle of Life at the end of Lynn's memorial, which was, incredibly, everybody managed not to cry until that point went faced with that song. But it is a miracle of staging and a validation of being brave, because Julie Taymor, at that point, when Disney asked her to take on The Lion King, which was the first show that came to London, even though they'd done Beauty and the Beast on Broadway, she wasn't really known at all as a theatre director or a musicals director. In my memory, her biggest claim to fame was that she'd done an adventurous Tempest with Fiona Shaw, and so she was new hands, new broom, new thoughts, and brilliant to come up with that opening, which, as you say, still lasts beautifully. And interestingly, her niece Dana is also enjoying huge success on Broadway in the other show that makes what to get on playing, which is The Outsiders, which people who've seen it have really adored. So there's obviously something in the Taymor genes.
Speaking of The Outsiders, I know last week we spoke about Lin-Manuel Miranda's Warriors, and a lot of people are theorising that the reason that Warriors hasn't come to the stage and actually started as an album is because Outsiders and Warriors sit in very similar camps in terms of the subject matter, and they're both based on films, and in a way Warriors wants to wait until Outsiders has cleared off before they bring it in, because you can only have one film based on a cult group of vagabonds on Broadway at any one point.
Trying to get somewhere.
Yes, but the other link is obviously Elton John. Almost to bring it full circle, another excellent segue. You did signpost this one earlier. Elton John has a new musical on Broadway that started in the UK at the Almeida, which is
Tammy Faye. That's just about to open, and I'm fascinated how that will go down, because the American view of Tammy Faye, televangelist, good person in terms of her advocacy for people suffering from AIDS, complicated person in terms of her telesales of kitchens around the notion of God.
And some of her financial dealings.
And some of her financial dealings. I mean, she wasn't known here. So that was both a blessing and a problem, because it meant that people didn't really have a hook to love Tammy Faye on. On Broadway, of course, everybody will know her and will have a view. So I wonder how much they will have changed James Graham's book, particularly, to make it land better there. I really liked it as a show. I thought it had brilliant songs and great energy. And I hope, again, that it might sort of be reshaped, restructured a little bit on Broadway and then return, because it certainly was a musical that tackled a lot of the issues of our times about the rise of the evangelical right. And it seemed very of its moment and had quite a short run at the Almeida and now hopefully is going for a longer one in the States.
It's that classic James Graham bait and switch where you think it's a play or a musical about one thing when actually it's a play or a musical about another thing. So Dear England, for example, isn't just a play about an England football team. It's about a nation going through huge seismic change from 2016 to 2023 and now 2024. In the case of Tammy Faye, it is to some extent a story about an oddball American TV personality, but also much more profoundly, it's about the muddying of the water between church and state.
Yeah.
And that's where it really becomes quite juicy and potent. And I think that speaks so much more to the present day in the US potentially than it does in the UK when you look at some of the rhetoric around the US election, for example. I'm again, like you say, I'm really, really interested to see how it goes down.
Yeah.
They've also taken over Katie Braben, who won an Olivier Award for her amazing performance as Tammy Faye. So you've got a Brit taking on an iconic American figure on Broadway. So I'm very intrigued to see how they respond to her.
And I was very pleased by that because she was astounding. And there was, I think, some question about whether she was a big enough name to carry a show in New York. And it's brilliant that they backed her and trusted her to land the part. So yeah, that's another reason to get on play. I'm going to go and examine my bank balance.
Yeah, or we can see if Virgin Atlantic wants to sponsor us.
Yes. Hello, Virgin Atlantic. We'd like to go to Broadway.
Yeah, all those shows that we need to see.
Anyhow, there's a lot coming on in London as well.
That's true. We can go back to resume our normal programming.
Yeah, which we'll talk about in the coming weeks.
Yes.
But for now, I think that's probably enough from me, Sarah Crompton.
And from me, Alex Wood. Make sure you like, follow, subscribe, and leave comments wherever you do, and tune in for next week's episode on Friday.